Good morning, everyone joining us today. Well, it would be more appropriate to say good afternoon as well to everyone listening to us online. Now we will be speaking about wildlife conservation in Ukraine in accordance with European Union standards, maybe improving it, comparing to the situation that we have right now. And we have invited Mr. Ostap Semerak, the Minister for Ecology and Nature Resources, Mr. Jose Manuel Hernandez, the First Secretary of the Competition Policy and Energy Market Reform Program at the EU Delegation to Ukraine, Mr. Mykola Kuzio, the Euro Integration Deputy Minister of Ecology and Natural Resources, Mr. Ostap Jednak, MP Ralph Yulih, the team leader at the EU project Support to Ukraine and Approximation of the EU Environmental Acquis, Mr. Andriy Andrusevych, the Senior Analyst at the Society and Environment Resource Analysis Center, and Oleksiy Vasylyuk, an ecologist from the Environment Law People International Charitable Organization. All right, if you don't mind, I will be kicking it off. Unfortunately, Mr. Ostap is running a little late, but we hope he will be joining us as soon as possible, as soon as he arrives. And it's incredibly important for the Ukrainian government and parliament to be working together. And Mr. Ostap is representing the profiled committee, and joined with Mr. Ostap Vidnik, we are working together on many topics. I would like to start not by presenting Ostap, but by expressing my gratitude for a highly esteemed panel joining us here. It's incredibly pleasant also to see a great number of experts in the audience, as the topic is incredibly important, and it's important for several reasons. In its content, the problem that we are trying to tackle today, and today's presentation of the draft law, is an incredibly important event. And we are hoping that the discussion around this draft law within the time allocated will be just as active. On the other hand, it's also important that we are demonstrating our joint view with the European Union and with the institutions of the European Union, and we are also demonstrating joint work, which is not always smooth, but it goes to show that it is alive, with the expert community and with representatives of the civil society. And I am pleased that today's presentation is a joint product of work, and I would like to express my gratitude for this active and high-quality work to our colleagues, our partners, the EU delegation in Ukraine, the project APINA, and the Resource Analysis Center Environment Law People for jointly organizing this discussion, this platform for discussion, and for supporting our common efforts. It's very often that people live in a way that they treat nature in an unconscious way, without understanding that our activities have great influence on the environment that we are living in, that it influences the future of development of systems. And it's quite often that our activities are detrimental, irreversibly detrimental to the environment. And obviously, it is time for us to give very serious consideration to this issue. This is now a matter concerning not only enthusiasts and experts, but also representatives of various societal institutions, of various organizations. And so the discussion around the draft law has to become one of the stages for recognition, conscious understanding, and change in Ukraine's social life. As of today, a separate system of wildlife preservation is in effect in Ukraine. That's the system of national reserves, national parks, etc. But at the same time, in the world, a different system is in place, which reveals new instruments. And this system is more flexible, better adaptable, and from our point of view, the time has come for us to take a deeper and more full-fledged approach to European systems and introduce them in Ukraine. And our roadmap for this type of work is the association agreement, and the experience of the European states that we are using is important and educatory for us. But from my point of view, it's incredibly important for us, while implementing European standards and European approaches, to do so while taking into account the European experience of how the system works, and also taking into account the particularities, the peculiarities that may be presented by our Ukrainian experience. And here perhaps we shouldn't be afraid of creating a Ukrainian bicycle. We aren't doing that. We're just adapting it to Ukrainian roads, the instrument that is widely used and applied in the European Union. Speaking about the goals that we currently have, we have to mention the implementation of two directives, the Wild Bird and the Habitants Directive, and the draft law that will be presented today for discussion, for initial discussion, is aiming to implement in the Ukrainian law these two European directives. Overall, when we are talking about the evaluation of the national law system, at the moment when the association agreement was signed, it was recognized that Ukraine has quite a high level of compatibility with the requirements of the Wild Bird and the Habitats Directive, but we want to become better, we want to improve, and we want to solve in a more comprehensive way the problems that we have right now, and we want to introduce a more comprehensive system. So currently we have at least two priority tasks. On the one hand, we have to analyze and to rectify the lacunas that exist in the Ukrainian legislative body, in the laws that are currently in force. And on the other hand, we have to evaluate the effectiveness of the current laws implementation. And so on the second stage, we will have to modernize, update the body of laws, taking into account the results of such an analysis. Now, what are the steps that we ought to take in the first place? The first step is work that will be directed at solving the issue of creating and providing for the effective functioning of a system of nature conservation territories that will somehow resonate with the Natura 2000 system that is in place in Europe. And we would also like to introduce additional amendments to Ukrainian law to improve the system of protection of certain species of flora and fauna. When we are talking of such an ambitious plan, it's quite obvious that the issue arises. The issue of why are we suggesting a law that will, well, if you don't mind my saying so, exist in parallel. It will create a parallel system to the one that is already in place in Ukraine. From our point of view, it is a matter that we are to discuss during the discussion process, but on the one hand, we understand that the current law is quite often more rigid, and it implements limitations that unfortunately are not always observed in real conditions. The model that exists in the European Union is perhaps more flexible, it is perhaps more effective, it is better adapted to particular cases, and this obviously can provide for the effectiveness and efficiency in choosing the correct scenario of action when solving particular tasks. On the other hand, what I am observing in my work is that it's quite often that our colleagues from, say, closely related spheres of activity are quite aggressive in their perception of the limitations that are provided by the nature fund law, for example. And so I think that the European system that is at the base of this new draft law allows us not to scare off business, investors, territorial communities, but at the same time to provide for a scientifically based approach to flora and fauna conservation. I hope that in our today's discussion, the experts in their presentations will provide a comparative analysis of the two systems, so I will not be stealing away from them. Just to sum it up, I would like to probably just mention a few things about issues that will probably attract the attention of experts and of lawmakers, the financial side of this whole matter. I would like to, well, it's unfortunately quite difficult to provide exact calculations at the moment. Of course, we are not analyzing the matter of what is right to say, whether we should be making money or conserving nature, because in this issue, in this question, the answer is absolutely obvious and it's not on the agenda. But for an effective fulfillment of any sort of decision, including one declared by law, we should understand what will be included into the expenses and what will be included into the incomes. And these calculations have been carried out, and honestly, I can tell you that the funds that are provided for the fulfillment, for the implementation, are quite clear and absolutely manageable, if you don't mind my saying so. What we were using as the initial data, when performing calculations, we were relying on the pilot project, which was carried out in the Pyryatinski National Park, and we arrived at the conclusion that the cost of developing of a pilot management plan at this particular plan was around €3 per hectare. So when we are talking about the areas that we have in Ukraine, that's around 6 million hectares, we understand that throughout the upcoming 10 years, we will have to mention expenses around up to €2 million per year. So it seems to me that this is quite manageable and quite understandable and an acceptable figure in light of the aims that we've got. Apart from the preparation of plans, the experts have also calculated that the implementation of management plans will require certain funds, and the figures here are a bit more unclear. It depends on what the goal will be, the goals included in the MPs, but the maximum amount currently calculated is around €30 million for the whole emerald network of Ukraine. And average cost, yes, it's right. I mean, I'm just checking my notes. So I think that the Ukrainian MPs will not be shocked by the expenses. We have to understand that apart from expenses from the state budget, the implementation of such a model will also foresee the inclusion, the use of European funds. And I would like to reiterate one more time that last week we had a meeting with the European Commissioner on environment, where the Ukrainian delegation mentioned as a goal of cooperation, it was clearly stated that one of the goals for Ukraine joining the Life Plus program, this was received favorably by my colleague, Commissioner Wella, and this program foresees the the use of European costs for the implementation of the model that is foreseen by the law. So I think that we have all the chances, we have great chances to not only implement the European experience, but also to use European costs for flora and fauna conservation in Ukraine based on the principles laid down in the European Union in the model that is envisioned and described in the draft law. Also, I would like to say that when similar decisions were discussed in the European Union, record figures for public participation in such discussions were achieved, and the huge number of interested people involved in this discussion today provides grounds for hopes that also this discussion will be quite popular in Ukraine. So I am kindly asking everyone to join as actively as possible, to also involve colleagues and partners into discussing the draft law. The goals that we are currently setting for ourselves for the upcoming months is to hold a discussion, and based on the results of the public discussion, to also have expert consultations to update the draft law, and then to initiate the process of agreeing upon the text of the law within the Cabinet of Ministers, and then presenting it for voting at the Verkhovna Rada, at the Ukrainian Parliament. Excuse me for taking up so much time. So now I will be passing on to Mykola Stepanovich. Thank you very much for the description and for the introductory word. I would now pass the word to Mr. Jose Manuel Hernandez, representing the European Union delegation in Ukraine. Thank you, Mr. Jose.
Thank you very much, dear Minister, ladies, gentlemen. I am actually very happy to be here today. Today's presentation actually is quite an important milestone in the field of nature protection for Ukraine. The colleagues actually from the ministry, together with our APINA expert, Mr. Yulih, will be able actually now to explain the details of this draft law, together with actually the benefits and costs. But I would actually just want to say a few words of why actually this draft law is important. As you actually know, the association agreement actually has got 2 EU directives in the field of nature protection. The minister has already mentioned these 2. One is the so-called EU Wild Birds Directive. The other one is actually the Habitats Directive. Now, the Emerald Network actually is a cross-cutting legal requirement. It is an international network which is actually made of special conservation areas, and it's not only actually important for these 2 directives, but also for the Berne Convention, which is also a requirement for Ukraine as a member party. This network also is an important one because it actually requires the harmonization of biodiversity standards. So far, Ukraine has got 271 Emerald Network registered areas. However, this actually is not fully formalized yet. So what we actually hope with the draft law, which is going to be presented today, is to be able to actually establish what actually needs to be done to formally establish and to actually ensure the long-term preservation of these areas. And last but not least, actually, I would like to really thank the minister and his services, because really they show the commitment and drive to actually make this draft law happen. And without taking any more time, I would just like to hope that this actually gives the necessary momentum actually for this draft law to make it to the next step and eventually to get adopted. Because let's not forget that passing laws is a very hard political exercise, but the actual work is in the implementation and transportation, where you actually have to change a lot of systems and pass a lot of bylaws. So there's actually hope that we can actually process with this further. Thank you very much.
Дуже дякую, шановні колеги.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. If you don't mind, we have a suggestion to have a look at a relatively short cartoon presented by the Bern Convention on the Emerald Network in Ukraine. Each species of animals, of flora and fauna, requires certain environments. Unfortunately, currently these environments are negatively influenced by various factors, and as a result, a huge loss of biodiversity occurs, happening 100 times faster than under natural conditions, which is why we have to take measures to conserve our natural habitats. This is where the Emerald Network comes in. Developed in accordance with the Bern Convention, the Emerald Network is a group of selected natural territories created with the aim of preserving natural habitats which contain biodiversity of European significance which is endangered, using coordinated and rational management. As of now, around 3,500 sites exist with a general territory of 600,000 square kilometers, which represent 12 of the territories of the 16 countries involved in the Emerald Network. Together with the Natura 2000, another network that exists in the European Union, the Emerald Network will create the largest nature reserved territory system in the world. The Emerald Network will increase the growth of benefits from nature preservation. The benefits of the Emerald Network are huge, both sociologically, from a social, ecological, and natural point of view. The Emerald Network in Europe will come into effect in 2020 as an unprecedented result of cooperation in wildlife preservation at the European level. Governments, organizations, businesses, and civilians are bidding on this initiative coming into effect. For it to be effective, we require everyone to make their bid, because without a flourishing nature, the future does not exist. Thank you very much. So I will now suggest that we pass on to the next issue planned in our discussion. My colleagues have already mentioned the importance of have already mentioned some of the difficulties that we might encounter in implementing the Bird and Habitats Directive and the Emerald system. And so in this context, it's important to view the experience of the European Union from the point of view of assessing the implementation and functioning of wildlife protection directives, the Bird Directive and the Habitats Directive. In 2016, I have already performed such, Ralph has already performed such an evaluation where he evaluated the effectiveness of these networks in the European Union, as well as expenses and benefits received by the European member states from the existence of various nature preservation territories. So I think the discussion and the analysis of this experience are going to be important for us to understand and to talk about, so that we plan just as well the corresponding legislation on implementing these directives in Ukraine. So now I would invite Mr. Andriy Andrusevych to speak, the senior analyst at the Society and Environment Resource Analysis Center, and he will tell us more about the corresponding analysis that was performed by the center. Thank you, Mr. Mykola. Yes, so this is the result of our third analysis, third research as to how in Ukraine we could and should implement the Bird and Habitats Directive. And this research was provoked by the context so to say, the context of deregulation, which is the general political context in the European Union, and which is also on the agenda in Ukraine. So we were interested to see how in this context in the European Union, wildlife conservation is viewed within the contexts of the wild birds and the Habitats Directive. But I would like to start with a different issue. It's incredibly important to take into account the fact that we are having such a meeting organized by the Ministry for Ecology and Natural Resources on green issues, on issues relating to wildlife preservation. Usually when we talk about ecology, we're talking about industrial pollution and so on. But matters of conservation of flora and fauna and of habitats are no less important for the quality of life for all of us. So in relation to the processes that occurred in the European Union, formerly this was called the fitness check. It had as the goal to evaluate whether they, the European Union, whether they need these territories, whether the goals were formulated correctly, whether they were achievable through creating the Natura 2000 network and through various other mechanisms for wild bird and other species of flora and fauna preservation. I would like to say that the key result after a 3-year research was that yes, the directives are absolutely correct. They are still on the agenda of the European Union. For Ukraine, the resolution is quite simple. The implementation of these directives is important in the context of association, the association agreement, and the Ukraine-EU relations. In other words, we should not be indifferent to this matter. As the minister has stated today, this fitness check provoked the greatest reaction of the society in the history of various societal consultations. More than 500,000 people reacted and were involved in societal consultations. Out of these various answers received, 99% of them were received from natural persons, not from organizations. And in this context, the directives are seen in the European Union as an important element of the joint market. So for Ukraine, it might also be important in the context of the free trade area with the European Union. And finally, probably the most important result concerning the process of evaluation itself is that in Ukraine it can be used as an instrument for establishing a dialogue between deregulators and the ecologists, the green ones. This dialogue, whether we like it or not, is taking place. We see that sometimes it's quite complicated. These frames, these key issues and questions that are raised in the process of evaluation as effectiveness, efficiency, etc., to understand whether we need it or not, are incredibly interesting. So the mechanisms for establishing for such a dialogue are also interesting. What concerns the forms of implementation of these particular directives in their content, I would like to say that the directives are not only binding, but they also represent huge possibilities for Ukraine. First of all, in the area of nature conservation, but also they open up huge political perspectives. But with possibilities, we receive challenges. The challenges will come from business, for example, their resistance and the resistance of hunting businesses. And here we will require huge support from the community and from the mass media. We have seen the huge story with the moose. We had one single species, and here within this law we are talking about thousands of species, so it will be incredibly different. But as to the general regime of bird conservation, especially in the part of hunting, our law is relatively close, extremely close to the norms that are currently stipulated in the directives. As to creating new nature conservation territories, it will be a huge challenge politically, and we will have to help the ministry. And if the minister, just like today, will be defending these issues, we will need support and it will be important. As to financial challenges, they are going to be there. I would like to say that in the European Union, the expenses for supporting this network are about 5.8 million euro. That's around 64 euro for a hectare. I completely agree with the assessments provided by the minister that the cost for Ukraine will be lower, but still it will be quite significant. On the other hand, what was another result of this assessment in the European Union was that the benefits received by the European Union are just incommensurate. You cannot compare them. The evaluation is around 200 or 300 million per year. That's how much the European Union member states receive in various benefits from the functioning of the network. The recreational business is receiving no less than 35 million euros from the existence of Natura 2000 objects. So in this sphere, we will have to carry out an effective informational campaign so that we deliver to various sectors of the society the financial benefits, among others, of the creation of such an environmental system in Ukraine. Now, to sum up, as to my thesis, as to my point on opportunities, we have heard quite a bit today about the Emerald Network. It's an important step. Yes, this is also a nature conservation network that is created on the basis of the Berne Convention, but it's a pan-European process. Countries of Europe are taking part, including Belarus, Russia. This is not some sort of exclusive process within the European Union Ukraine agreement. If Ukraine has this associated status, these directives create particular opportunities for Ukraine in the context of implementing these two directives. And I think it would be an ambitious political goal for these territories, objects created on the basis of the Emerald Network, become Natura 2000 sites. Well, of course, the direct implementation of Natura 2000 in Ukraine is incredibly complicated, partly because we are not a member of the European Union. Many steps that have to be taken involve, say, various steps taken by European Union institutions, but I think such modalities could be subject to bilateral agreements between Ukraine and the European Union, because we should be having a dialogue. This is a bilateral relation, so that we politically arrive at the result that these territories be created under certain requirements by the directives, under certain modalities, and they become associated members of Natura 2000. This would allow us to join the financing within the West Used system to manage these territories. We are talking about hundreds of new territories that would be created parallel to the existing natural reserves. These are not reserves, these are special territories. They are not reserves in our understanding. This is a parallel world which is functioning in European countries, but such a political project would be important. And as far as I know, there is a requirement that 10% of Life Plus funds be directed towards wildlife programs. There are other programs, also management, etc. So this would allow for creating a sustainable, perhaps not 100%, but a sustainable long-term finance source for the existence of such a network in Ukraine. That would be all from me. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Andriy, for presenting your the analysis and for the ideas that you have set forward. I think that the draft law and this conceptual approach that are going to be presented today they both represent movement towards this ambitious political goal that you have mentioned, which is going to be shared by all of us and for which all of us are going to be looking for the instruments. And on our way, we will find various legal solutions on how to establish this dialogue with the European Union as to agreements. So, but a necessary prerequisite for starting this law is to, for this way, is to have the basic legislation that will allow us to move towards this ambitious goal. So if we show positive dynamics, I think it will be easier and more realistic for us to reach our goal. As to Life Plus, as the Minister has mentioned, we have already kicked off informal consultations as to joining. There are some legal regulations, the contribution of a particular country to the program, but we may say that the process has been initiated, talks have started, so we are hoping that we will be able to round it off as soon as possible, even though we understand that it's a lasting process. We have the experience of Ukraine joining COSMA and other European Union projects. We understand that it is going to take time. Now, please allow me to pass on to presenting the conceptual approach on implementing the Habitats and Wild Birds directives and the development of the Emerald Network in Ukraine, and invite Mr. Ralph Yulih to speak, the team leader at the EU project, jointly with Apina, to present the conceptual approach towards the draft law, and later I will also invite other colleagues to speak.
Okay, I see the presentation. I don't know if people in the audience can read it because it's quite small, but maybe I would like to use the opportunity to walk a bit around and, oops, sorry for that. Just a sec. I don't need this headset. First of all, quickly introducing myself. My name is Ralph Yulih. I'm the APENA project team leader, and I'm also an environmental lawyer specialized in nature protection legislation. And in this role, so I'm not coming here today as the team leader of the APENA project, which is a multi-component project, but only as a lawyer who has been heavily involved, cooperating with a working group in the Ministry of Ecology and Nature Protection on this new draft law. Together with Nastia, I hope that you will compliment me afterwards. I would like to give you a short overview and introduction, a very quick one, into what is the entire law actually about that we are talking about. You heard already a lot of issues. Frankly speaking, if I would hear the very first time about this issue, I would be a bit messed up. Because I hear there are two directives, there is Natura 2000, there is this term Emerald Network. So what is the relation of all these aspects? How do they link? First of all, please be aware that these two directives, which make up the cornerstone of European nature protection legislation, the first one, the one for the birds protection, dates back to the year 1979 already. And the reason was to adopt such a directive in 1979 that although all the EU member states have quite advanced nature protection legislation in place, the same as in Ukraine, the issue of bird protection was always underestimated. And the EU took up this issue because you have a lot of migratory birds, and this obviously is a transboundary issue. And this is why it was decided to adopt this directive, which focuses particularly on the protection of migratory and other wild birds which are threatened by exploitation, even extinction. This directive was then changed and repealed in the year 2009. This is why it's now called the Wild Birds Directive of 2009. Later, in 1992, the EU decided also to have a more broader approach and protect or set benchmarks for the protection of all kinds of natural habitats and habitats of species in the EU, and these are part of the EU directive. Basically, what you can say is that these two directives have now established a two-pillar approach. The first pillar is basically the protection of species, of animals, fauna, flora, plants, species, by means of restrictions, prohibitions, hunting prohibitions, killing prohibitions, sampling prohibitions, etc., and with very detailed annexes on protected species. So this is the first part, which you currently find also to a large extent in existing Ukrainian legislation. You have in Ukraine the laws on fauna and flora, you have the law on red list. So this legislation is in place, and it is largely, I would say, already in line with EU legislation, and very little needs to be changed in this legislation to bring it in line with the EU concept. However, the main challenge that we are facing in Ukraine is the issue that there is not yet established a very clear ecosystem which is comparable to the Natura 2000 system which was established in the EU. So this Natura 2000 system is the second key pillar which has been established by means of the Birds and the Habitats Directive. And since Ukraine is not a member state, not a candidate country to the EU, in the association agreement, it has been decided that instead of doing something towards Natura 2000, it will be the Emerald Network under the so-called Bern Convention. The Bern Convention is a multi-country convention which is basically quite similar to the Birds and the Habitats Directive in this respect, and the Emerald Network, which is supposed to be established in all the member states, including Ukraine, can be considered as the equivalent to this Natura 2000 system in EU. And the challenge was now, in past months, in order to get a step forward, that this new legislation on this Emerald Network has been drafted and is currently under review and discussion. And it is the first time that this law, which is basically complementary to all the other legislation, will establish a system not just for the designation of these sites and the adoption, but also for the management of these protected sites. In the long term, of course, it would be advisable, as it is done in most EU member states, to merge all these nature protection related laws into one consistent piece of legislation. But this is something what we have decided that may be done in a couple of years from now, and for the time being we are focusing on this law on the Emerald Network. Maybe the next slide. You have the next one? Well, actually there is a slide which is on the economic and social benefits and ecological benefits. Yeah, this is the one. I doubt that it is really readable, but lots of this has already been mentioned, and I don't want to repeat too much on this. As my colleagues were emphasizing, the costs for the establishment and then the management, these are the two pillars of the Emerald Network, is quite immense. And the Natura 2000 network has been assessed of costing up to 6 billion euro in the EU. However, the benefits, and this is been also represented in a study from the EU side, from the Commission, are outnumbering these costs by far in terms of not just ecotourism. Ecotourism is a very prominent tool which has been promoted by the establishment of the Natura 2000 sites. Then, of course, you have the issue of the re-establishment of wetlands and avoidance of flood problems. You have the issue of climate protection. You have the issue of resources saving, natural resources, etc. So a lot of economic advantages which are stemming from this Natura 2000 concept. There is a precise even example from France where the costs were balanced against the economic benefits, and it turned out that the economic benefits are far higher than actually the costs for the implementation of the Natura 2000 system. So what the law is basically providing for, as Mykola was saying, it is establishing a legal basis for the identification and designation of the emerald sites in Ukraine. As we were already listening, you have already 271 proposed and approved emerald sites, but they have to be formally now designated according to Ukrainian legislation. But the far more important part is then, what does it actually mean Once you have these emerald sites in the country, what is the impact of this? And there it comes the main tools that we have in EU legislation and we have incorporated in the draft of the Ukrainian legislation. The first one is the issue of management plans. Basically, you should understand that all these emerald sites have very specific conservation objectives, and these management plans shall help individually to achieve these conservation objectives. This is exactly what is done in the EU member states for all their Natura 2000 sites. And the second big stick, I would say, in this Natura 2000 concept in EU is the so-called appropriate assessment. This means that all kinds of activities which are supposed to be taking place in the area of these protected sites are carefully assessed. And as you may all know, you have now, and this is a very good step forward, for a couple of months in place this environmental impact assessment law in Ukraine, a big step in environmental policy and legislation. And you should use this instrument also in the future for the assessment of potential impacts on emerald sites and then draw the respective conclusions in accordance how it is done also in European member states. I think this shall be it for the moment. We may receive further questions, and I agree, by the way, with the issue that this issue of Natura 2000 or Emerald Network gives a much more flexibility and scientifically based evaluation and protection of these sites. And this is the big difference, to my understanding, also from the nature protection regime that you have established under the current system in the Ukraine. Nastya, you would like?
Good afternoon, everyone. As Ralph mentioned, I have worked jointly on the work on this draft law at the Ministry. My name is Anastasia Drapaliuk, and I would like to express my gratitude to all members of the initiative group who have agreed to work, to spend their time, to spend their efforts, their resources, their energy on working on this draft law. Our work has taken place over several months with certain stops. We met almost every week. The cooperation was just like on TV. We had discussions, we had ideas discarded, returned to them. It was incredibly complicated, and I feel we are going to continue because we have developed only the basis, and the basis is very far from the ideal, and we will keep working on it. So I would like to dwell in more detail on what Ralph has started discussing. So what are the peculiarities of this new system that we are laying into the foundation of this draft law? One peculiarity would be referred to as moving from nature, defending, protecting nature to nature conservation. What this means is that the draft law foresees the definition of certain species. We will have around 200 species of animals and around 60 flora species, and also a number of habitats that are outlined by the Berne Convention. The numbers are not so huge if we take into account the number of species that are present in Ukraine, and conserving these species and habitats is the goal of this draft law. If the current system, which is great and it will continue to function, if we protect territories in this new draft law, we are going to conserve not territories, but particularly the species and the habitats that are indicated in the annexes. The second issue that differs from the existing system and what is laid down in the new system is the geographical approach. What it is and why it's so important. If now a nature conservation territory is created due to certain scientific foundations, so we receive recommendations and so on. We are not going to use this approach now. So it will not be possible for someone to lodge a proposal and so we will create an emerald network. No, the system will work globally. Each particular species will be evaluated, what its number is, where it is located in Ukraine, not only in Ukraine, by the way, but the evaluation will be carried out within European areas. So we will take into account the numbers of this species for other countries of Europe on all of its migration routes, where it needs to feed, etc., etc., etc. And so, based on this evaluation, we will determine what are the key points on each species and its habitats, what are the key points in Ukraine for preserving this territory. So the more biodiverse a country is the more it has to have these nature conservation territories. So we will not have a certain the approach that we need to have a certain percentage, or we will not have general numbers and statistics. We will base our conclusions on very particular work by scientists as to the needs of particular habitats and particular species. As to the management plan, I will not repeat what was mentioned by Ralph. I would only like to say that for each, again, one more time, for each species, for each habitat, a plan will be developed of what this species and this habitat requires to be conserved. It may be so that it requires nothing, so that the scientists say, we just need to leave it as it is, and that will be a step taken as well. Maybe we need to take certain additional measures, additional research, additional, say, we should perform mowing at a different time, maybe hunting should be prohibited at a given period, and this will be laid down in the management plan. But the aim of the management plan is to achieve favorable conservation status for each species. This is clearly, in the European Union, we have favorable conservation status. We currently decided to implement what is called good conservation status in Ukraine. We aren't able to achieve all the goals set out by the European Union, so we set the benchmark a little lower, but we aspire to the highest result possible as well. What I would like to say as to evaluating environmental impacts, so what will be the prohibitions introduced? Currently, our draft law does not foresee not a single prohibition at the level of the law. No prohibitions. Maybe we will introduce them in the process of agreeing with the society, but currently they are removed from the draft law. So how certain prohibitions will be introduced, not on the territory, but for certain types of activity. So a certain activity will be evaluated on this territory. It will be defined whether it is going to harm a given species or habitat. Will it provide for favorable conservation status or not? And based on this analysis, for a given territory, a scientific analysis, we will introduce prohibitions or not introduce prohibitions on certain activities. Another important aspect is reporting and monitoring. This is a huge problem. We have mentioned the moose already. When we started analyzing the numbers for the moose, it turned out that we don't possess the data. It's very difficult to accumulate it. Well, it is accumulated, but the process does not correspond to European Union standards, and we do not foresee future outcomes. So this is another aspect that we need to change in our country. This analysis and this database, the organization of this database, has to be compatible with European Union data repositories of the Berne Convention, etc. We're not going to introduce anything else. We're going to use what they already have as an example, and we will simply implement it in our system. And so if we succeed in implementing this draft law, maybe in a decade, we hope that this will be a high-quality approach. It will be a change in the management system within the sphere of wildlife conservation. We will achieve how do I formulate it? Not a statistical approach. We will achieve particular results in nature conservation. Thank you. Thank you very much, Anastasia. I would only have a minor, but I think a correct rectification, not if, but when we achieve this goal. So I think if we don't have the goal set out in black and white, maybe it will be more difficult for us to undertake this complicated challenge. So I would also like to say that in the materials that you've received, you have the infographics dealing with the draft law. So if you acquaint yourselves with it, it will be easier to continue the discussion. It includes both what Ralph and Anastasia have mentioned. It also includes the fitness assessment that Mr. Andriy presented. So we will be able to plunge even more deeply and to process the material even more comprehensively. I would like now to introduce Oleksiy Vasylyuk, representing the Environment Law People International Charitable Organization, to comment on the Emerald Network in Ukraine. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I would kindly ask us to provide the last presentation in the second slide. So why NGOs are so interested in this idea and in this initiative? I will say that several times I will reiterate that in this process, Ukraine is not just fulfilling, putting a tick in the Euro integration process. It is unique within the process. First of all, why Ukraine is so unique, we would see that apart from Russia, who has no aspirations of joining the European Union, we are the only country made up of steppe territories. So we have a huge part of our country that is constituted of natural habitats that are represented nowhere else in Europe, which makes us unique. And if we introduce the European approach to wildlife conservation, it would mean to introduce it, first of all, for those ecosystems and for those types of nature where these approaches were never introduced. So why, in my opinion and the opinion of my colleagues, the creation of the Emerald Network and the biogeographical approach is so important? First of all, it is a global assessment of which species are to be conserved. So for the first time, we fulfill the scientific approach to wildlife conservation. I have already provided numerous groundings for the creation of reserves, but they are created where it is possible to agree upon them. The Emerald Network or the Natura 2000 is not agreed upon. It's just a verdict from the scientists of what needs to be conserved. This is a dynamic network. Every 6 years, a re-evaluation is carried out, and if today we have a colony of a certain species on the island of Olzhin in Kiev, and in 6 years it moves to a different island, it will mean that it will need to be preserved and conserved there and not formally assign the status to the island since it was assigned once. So this is a dynamic scientific evaluation of what and when needs to be protected. The most important thing is that we are talking about species that are evaluated at European level. So for example, the unfortunately untranslatable, one of the species that is protected by the Red Law is the most banal type of species of bird for the European Union. It is not its territory of living in Ukraine, and so for us it is unique, but globally it is not an endangered or a rare species, so it makes sense to be preserved where it lives actively, not on our territory. Some types of butterflies in our red book are absolutely commonplace in Romania or Moldova or in Slovakia, and we are just the edge of their living territory. So this approach is more comprehensive because it allows to focus on what really needs to be preserved. Another moment is that it preserves pretty large territories. Species that are to be conserved are represented in different places. On average, for European Union countries, the Natura 2000 system covers 18% of the territory. For Ukraine, those are cosmic figures. So if we ever, when we achieve European figures in creating international wildlife networks, we will pretty much cover all the unique nature that we have in Ukraine, and it will not have to be agreed upon with the users. It will simply be introduced, effective conservation measures where the species are represented. And for now, it allows us to feel that we are on the verge of something that we have never experienced before. Of course, there are certain shortcomings. They have been mentioned today partially. And if all those present were participated in the original discussions, they would have heard that there are certain shortcomings in the work of these systems. Why that happens is that this is a new system. It hasn't been introduced for 50 years. The only approach to the Natura 2000 and the Emerald network outside of the European Union was only agreed upon in 2010, so it is introduced only now. Of course, you might hear that there are certain shortcomings. That's not a problem. It just goes to show that the system is not fully finalized in other countries as well. It has mentioned several times today the Emerald network and Natura 2000. I would like to underscore that Natura 2000 is a network created within European Union countries, within the Berne Convention framework. The Emerald network is created. This is pretty much the same. In 2010, there was a special resolution of the Berne Convention mentioning that the principles for creating both networks are identical. As soon as Ukraine joins the European Union, the Emerald network will automatically become the Natura 2000 network, so we will not have to create them separately from each other, and our country becomes unique from such point of view. Slovakia and Poland, for example, and Serbia, I think, started creating the Emerald network, but as soon as they prepared it, they became EU member states, and their Emerald networks became naturally Natura 2000 networks. But we are not going to join the European Union in a moment, so we are going to become the first country that will have to live seriously for a long term with the Emerald network. It will not become Natura 2000 in a moment, overnight, and it will not receive all the opportunities of European member states. So maybe we don't have anyone to emulate, since we don't have an example of a country living with the Emerald network for a long time. So those countries that will be joining the process, for example, Belarus and Moldova, they will be forced to be the trailblazers in this aspect. So another thing I would like to say as to developing this network. On the slide, you have the network, the 271 territories that were agreed upon in 2016. It was the result of a few years of work from the developers, but at the moment when this network was agreed on, we criticized it heavily. Back then, nobody knew how seriously the process would move forward. It was initiated in 2009. No one knew that the association agreement would exist, which is why mostly the existing nature reserves and nature conservation territories were included. And we do recognize that most of these territories are important, but we understand that rare species don't exist there exclusively, which is why we thought about augmenting the list. We know that it's called in other countries the shadow list. We usually associate shadow with something negative, like the shadow economy or whatever, but the shadow list in this case means additional list of territories to be introduced. So the next slide, please. Could you please repeat it? Yes. And one more time, please. Yes, so we came up with the proposition to include the 3 river territories, the Sna. This is a huge territory in the Chernihiv Oblast. This is a massive amount of wildlife in the Chernihiv-Polisa region, because these territories are important for water and waterland birds that are conserved under the Berne Convention and for which the network is created. These territories were included into the network. And we understood that the society, through providing grounds for why certain territories have to be involved and have to be included into the Emerald network, it can achieve the necessary result. When this happened, if you please introduce the next slide, we moved it a step forward absolutely voluntarily. 26 scientists have joined the work who are either PhDs or doctors of science, a Ukrainian scientific term. We would like to provide scientific grounding for all the territories that will be important in the network, and we have developed the following 91 suggestions to the network. If you would please go on. If you combine the two maps, you would see that the additional territories augment the existing network. They introduce a wholesome network together with what was introduced initially. And you can see that most of them are located in the east of Ukraine. Well, it just happens so because no one was looking for wildlife over there. But in Luhansk, for example, 26% of the territory is made up of conservation territories. So we have huge territories in the east where huge floods occur each year, so they are extremely vulnerable from a natural point of view. And as I understand, the Ministry for Ecology have already addressed the Berne Convention to with the suggestion to include these 91 objects to the Emerald Network. And on my part, I can say that we are continuing work. It's incredibly pleasant to see numerous scientists addressing us with their suggestions, with their will to help, to edit what is there and to suggest new territories. The main thing we have in the future is not only the creation of new objects and including new objects to the existing territories, but also including new species to European documents, both the Habitats and the Wild Birds Directive and the Berne Convention. We have species that are represented in Ukraine exclusively, and so conserving them at a Europe-wide level, it is only possible to do that at the European level. So we have the Kamienny Mohyly Reserve in Ukraine in the east. We have two types of flora, two species of flora which are only met there. We have huge numbers of species in the Crimea which are only represented there. So it's incredibly important that European documents include these unique Ukrainian species into their documents and provide them with international status so that these widely agreed approaches allow for the conservation of not only Europe-wide species, but also what is represented uniquely in Ukraine and what makes our country unique. Thank you very much, and I pass the word to the next speaker. Thank you very much for an interesting presentation. I feel that it is time for us to move on to the discussion. Please make use of the microphone. Oleg Listopad. Well, introducing the discussion, I would like to say that this is fantastic. I am totally for. And when the ecological network was introduced, the pictures were even more fascinating, but the results were a bit underwhelming. So even though I'm fully for this initiative, I would like to ask the representative of the Ministry of Ecology, Mr. Vasylyuk, has evaluated the fulfillment of plans, and it's about 0.07% of fulfillment. So this is fantastic. Everything we're talking about is just breathtaking. But say the Dniprovsko-Teterivsky National Reserve, the project is there, the agreements are there, all the signatures are there, except for the Ministry of the Cabinet of Ministers and the Forest Agency. So one signature, and we will add 30,000 hectares to the wildlife conservation territory. Say another object, the Holodny Yar. There is also no agreement. I'm just talking about implementation here. We're talking about laws. There's just a little amount of work for the parliament to do. And some draft laws that were introduced there, they're just lying there collecting dust, say, moving the power from central bodies to the regional bodies. So when we talk about how existing laws are implemented, and when we hear from the ministry accented messages about the existing condition of the Nature Conservation Fund, every time we see presentations about international networks, it's fantastic. But when we move to the national level, I wouldn't like to be way too negative, but it's far, far from this beautiful level. So when will our national level meet the required plans, and what are the hurdles? What prevents us from being effective? Thank you for the commentary. It comes in a, well, not in the form of a rhetorical question, but I think the question already contains the answer. It's very difficult not to agree that we have numerous problems as to the Nature Protection Fund. But what we're talking about today is not an international thing for the international level. This is just an additional instrument, and as has been stated numerous times today, it has certain advantages. There are certain challenges, and we will have to learn to implement them in Ukraine. We will have to have a proper discussion. You have to understand, when you draw utopias, they don't work in real life. Utopia might be even more destructive than badly prepared solutions. So if some other laws are failing, stuttering, we need to understand what mechanisms they lack. So we want to have a discussion around the Emerald networks in a comprehensive way to see how it's going to work. My colleague mentioned that the procedure will not be as complicated in the agreement part as we currently have with the nature preservation territories, but it will not be voluntary because the procedure is clearly stated with participation from the Berne Commission, the Berne Convention. It has been said that the approach is quite creative on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's realistic for Ukraine, and the mechanisms that I laid down, what we can see from experience, they might work. It doesn't mean that it's going to be extremely simple. It's not going to be a piece of cake. We're going to have huge discussions. It has been mentioned by our colleagues with the business, especially in this sphere of agriculture. So this is a discussion that we have to go through. It has been gone through in European Union countries. And if we don't go down, if we don't participate as a unified team, as a unified front, if you don't mind my saying so, the nature conservation front, if we don't have a unified position, this discussion will be a lot more difficult to conduct. If in our environment we have way too many contradictory ideas, as a famous person said, when the opinion is the same, it means that no one has thought. But we need to have a discussion in such a way to make sure that the law works in practice. So we don't need another law on a network that will never work. We need something to work practically. So I think the flexibility that is provided in this approach, where under particular territories and particular species and particular habitats, certain conservation measures are taken, I hope it will provide for some scientific grounding. So the appropriate assessment that was mentioned, it's also an important instrument that will have to be clarified as to how it is going to be implemented. If we look at the implementation of the law on environmental impact assessment, it goes to show that it can be practically realized, fulfilled in Ukraine in the future. So I think that with this new instrument, we have no other way as to go through the path and to demand its implementation. As to the problems that we have currently, I think you are aware of the situation no less and no worse than some of our other colleagues. A work group is currently in place working on the implementation of the comments that we have received from the Cabinet of Ministers. The issue of the Holodny Yar is almost agreed upon with the law enforcement bodies. So it's the same situation. We have to move. We have to move the issue forward, and there is no other way apart from applying effort. I would like to offer a more positive comment. In a way, the territories are included into the Emerald network by a Berne Convention decision, and it's a serious argument. We can always say, when we fight for each particular territory, we can always refer to the decision made by the standing committee. So we have now an objection as to the levels, the water levels at the Oleksandrivsk water reserve, and it has been directed to a committee based on the fact that it's an emerald network, and say the step in Odessa. We will see. We haven't received answers. We haven't received from the Standing Commission. Maybe they will require us to do something. But as to the Dniprovsko-Teterivsky, you can see there's an orange stripe. We have included the whole area of Teteriv into the network because this is a large river in its natural condition with significant forest masses along its borders. So if we succeed, it might join the network this year. As to the Eia Law, when the law we are discussing today comes into effect, it will introduce certain changes to the Eia Law, naturally, because in certain moments we will have to mention also the fact that the territory belongs to the Emerald Network. This will be extremely efficient. Anytime anyone plans any sort of economic activity on the territory, it will be a requirement to provide adequate assessment as to how this activity will influence the territory. Someone might not like it, but we, me and you, Oleg Hryhorovich, we're going to enjoy that properly. Because it might look meek. Yes, it has been mentioned that the law looks meek. It doesn't mention any prohibitions. But when we happen to do agreement, when we have to perform an evaluation, it will be scientifically grounded. Otherwise, we will have continuous grounds for lawsuits, etc., and we will need to tackle negative influences on the territories again and again. So I feel, well, having joined the process, I have become a believer for the Emerald Network, and I feel that this is a mechanism that provides us with a chance to do things that we were unable to do previously. Yes, just a second. So the colleagues mentioned the Berne Convention, that certain decisions are made at this level. And my colleagues have mentioned another thing. So we have the territories already in the networks, but we still have no regime, no management plan. This law has to resolve this problem. So we implement a lot of decisions, but we need to solve the problem of practically managing the territories. So moving forward with conservation of the species and the habitats, we currently have no legal grounds. This draft law is meant to create the legal grounds, the legal framework for solving this issue, and then we will be able to move forward with the process. Thank you. My name is Richard. I'm an ecology student. Would you please comment on the following? As of 2002, the general territory of wildlife conservation in Ukraine was about 2.5 million hectares, and it has now reached 3.8 million hectares. As to the sustainable development goals until 2030, as the information is provided by the Ministry of Ecology and Nature, you are planning to augment this territory to 9 million hectares. So that's more than multiplying it in 2 in less than 15 years. So my question is do we really possess the resources, and is there really the possibility of achieving this goal in 15 years, even less than 15 years at the moment?
If this is really true, if Ukraine can actually achieve this result in less than 15 years.
Thank you. So I see you're stating the national goals for sustainable development that were developed in the course of the process, coordinated by the Ministry of Ecology. Okay, so there are a few comments. First of all, this is a reference document for us to take into account, in particular, sectoral policies. It is not agreed upon. It is just the result of the work of a wide community of experts. We had serious expert consultations. So in this context, I would advise you to look at the ecological policy strategy document until 2020, which has been introduced into the Cabinet of Ministers, and it will be agreed upon by the Cabinet of Ministers in shortly, and it will be introduced into the Parliament. And certain goals of ecological policy, numerically represented. So the goal stated there in percent, 16%, has been in place in Ukraine for quite a while now. And this is a goal that we, as the Ministry of Nature, are not going to give up, and we will be moving forward to achieve it. It has not been stated yesterday, you know. We are still committed to this goal, and we continue to commit to it in our ecological policy. Introducing this instrument will allow us the necessary opportunities for extending nature preservation territories. So Ralph will provide a commentary, but I think this issue is not legal, but it has to do more with policy goals that are to be achieved. Well, maybe I will provide just a few comments on what my department is working on, the creation of new conservation territories. So we know how difficult it is to introduce a new hectare into protected territories. At international level, when we have meetings, we discuss this issue. Almost every country introduces unreal goals, even at international levels, on wildlife conferences. This is more of a strategic goal that has to be achieved here. Well, we don't evaluate it as to whether it is real or unreal. It is just a goal, scientifically grounded, that we are to achieve at a certain moment. Whether we reach it until 2030, that's an issue. We will be working. We can't provide any guarantee. We are working, and we keep seeing these results in everyday work. We are seeking for territories. Remind you of the Chernobyl Biosphere Reserve. Now we have 3 presidential orders awaiting a signature as to extending 2 natural parks in the Carpathian Mountains, and one that has to do with waterland preservation in Azov. Then we have Dniprovsko-Teterivsky, Holodny Yar, Nobelivsky. So I mean, in each region, practically in each territory, we are either creating new territories or extending the existing ones. And this process is thankfully very active at the moment. We are working on it ardently, and if we don't achieve the set goal of 15%, then we will at least extend it very seriously. I would like to augment on this comment. As opposed to Anastasia, I am the subject of suggesting new territories, which are sometimes very difficult to agree upon, but it seems to me that some of the most important territories, the large-scale territories, is a political issue, not an issue of any other sphere. Explaining where a valuable natural territory is not difficult for experts. It is difficult to receive all the necessary agreements and approvals. Say the Desna Valley includes 70,000 land users, and to receive 70,000 approvals from them will not be very interesting. It will not be very simple. On the other hand, we have a huge military base. Only a 12th part of it is involved in military activities. So we have its size is 13 by 12 kilometers. It is a huge territory. So we have one single decision of the Ministry of Defense who would like to gain something, and for them to create a national park. And we will have the second largest national park in Ukraine, say the Borodinsk steppe. If all the adjacent territories are announced as wildlife preservation territories, we will have huge parks again and again. We have numerous parks like that. This is elementary. We need a a position from the Ministry of Defense, and that's E. Say in Kiev we have the polygon, another military area. And we're talking about huge areas here, super valuable. If we have the position of the MOD, we'll have a huge national park. The same thing, the Dniprovsko-Teterivsky Park. A new park is possible there. And then we have the green color in the east. The Luhansk is not parsed. No one is living there. So a political decision there would create one of the largest national parks just from a decision from the president. The scientific grounding is there, but we understand that Ukraine has not reached the level for taking such large-scale fundamental protection decisions. So we will try to introduce it from the direction of Europe. But I feel this is possible. These figures are absolutely achievable if it is wanted, if there is the will, not from you and me, but from Ukraine as a state.
Comment first of all on these figures. When I see this map, and I'm coming from Germany, and Germany is pretty industrialized, as you can imagine. And still, when I compare the designation of Natura 2000 sites, the territory in Germany, it looks more colorful than this map, even with the orange ones. So even in a country like Germany, we have probably, a higher level or a higher scope of territories designated as Natura 2000 sites. So from that perspective, I would say it is possibly an ambitious target for Ukraine to have these 9 million euro hectares. But on the other side, I very much appreciate that you do not stop at all at these 271 sites which you already designate or are in process of designation, but that you go far beyond and scientifically that you identify all the other areas, because this is exactly what was done also in the EU member states, basically. It was a gradual approach. It started in the late 90s, and basically until 2005 or so, all these areas were then evaluated, etc. And this is why we suddenly, or nowadays in Europe, have this 18%. 18% of European territory are designated Natura 2000 sites of land territory, plus the marine areas, which is another 6%. So from that perspective, I think you should be very ambitious. But let me comment now as a lawyer, also on one key issue that Mykola was stressing. This new law, why do you have so many laws and laws and laws? It should not be a law in itself, which is just adding up to the laws on fauna and flora and ecosystems and nature protection stocks whatsoever. No, this is a law which is very tiny. First of all, it's not overloaded. It is drafted in a way, currently hopefully still is, I haven't seen the last version, in a very pragmatic manner, so that really the implementation of this law is feasible. And when I say implementation, this new draft consists of these two elements. The first one is simply the legalization of the designation of this emerald site system. This is easy, because this is how it has already been done. Now it's more formalized, and so that we can give a status of these emerald sites in Ukraine. But then the second part is, okay, once these sites are designated, how do you protect them, conserve them? How do you implement? And there the mechanisms that we use in Europe, primarily management plans, as was the key issue. And there we have this pilot project under our project, where we show how such a management plan is developed and what kind of measures are in such plan, with stakeholder participation, etc. This is one of the key tools. And the second tool is then, of course, also this assessment of all kinds of activities. By the way, this assessment very often needs to restrictions and prohibitions. Yeah, when I hear the issue of balancing investment interest and nature protection or conservation, this is a conflict. Also in Europe, this is a conflict. And the system, which is established by the directives in the EU, then would give a preference to the protection of the conservation objective. And this is the benchmark. This is the red line. So whenever you are threatening the conservation objective of a protected site, you either have to compensate or remedy this interference, or you have to prohibit it, as simple as that. And this legal, very clear-cut basis is provided in the draft law. And this is probably different from the currently existing laws, which are not very effective, obviously, in practice.
Thank you for your comment. And і в нас є ще одне запитання.
Можна я ще
Остання ремарка, окей?
одна реакція на запитання, бо воно цікаве. Це свого роду така, знаєте, медаль, яка має два боки, бавитися з цифрами, я маю на увазі. З одного боку, це важливо бачити цю загальну цифру. З другого боку, не тільки загальна ця цифра, те, що має значення, як кажуть, what matters, так? Візьмемо по натурі, я по Смарагдові не хочу коментувати, по натурі 2000 мережі, яка створена на підставі директив. Словенія 30% території перекрила. Британія близько 6% там, чи 7% перекрила. Бачите, яка різниця? Так. Да. Але якщо ви глянете на кількість об'єктів, не на їх площу, на кількість, ви переходите також зовсім інші моменти порівняння. Це також впливає потім на управління цих об'єктів. Великі об'єкти, якщо ми по площі маємо на вас, вимагають складних планів управління. Складні плани управління вимагають складних методів їх реалізації цих планів управління. Тому різні країни, повторюю, йдуть різним шляхом. І це пов'язано не тільки з тим, що в Словенії, як в моєму прикладі, дуже багата природа, а в Британії геть виснажена природа. Це також пов'язано з іншими підходами до створення таких територій. Другий короткий коментар. В залежності, от ви кажете, до 30-го року, що означає створити? За механізмом європейських директив, це кілька етапів. Спочатку науковці працюють, визначають, де треба. Наголошую, не де ми можемо де погодження отримати, а де треба. Подають на Європейську комісію, Європейська комісія приймає рішення, і тоді держави мають 7 років, щоб, власне, створити таку територію, скажімо так. Уявляєте, да? Тобто це тривалий процес. Важко сказати, що, до чого ми, на якому етапі оце ваше створити, де ця цифра вийде. Загалом, я думаю, що розбудова за директивами до 30-го року цілком спроможна подвоїти площу, скажімо так, охоронюваних територій. Я не хочу це назвати природно-заповідним фондом, бо це не є в нашому розумінні заповідники. Це є ділянка землі, на якій може бути вже заповідник, чи заказник, чи ще щось, чи нацпарк, може не бути, на якій охороняється, як правило, 2, 3, 4 види. Все, крапка. Ви там далі живете, є землекористувачі, фермери і так далі, але на них накладаються певні обмеження. Саме в цей період часу, як от сказала пані Анастасія, не косити, там, чи ще щось, якихось заходів не вживати, да, чи певними не користуватися гербіцидами в якийсь період часу. Тому що саме в цей період часу. А не як в нашому розумінні, що це там ледь, може бути навіть з вилученням земель, там серйозний перелік зразу заборон, да, законом, тому і тут немає переліку заборон. Але ви розумієте, про що я говорю. Тому в контексті розширення буде важлива не тільки площа, але й кількість, повторюю. Це дуже важливо, цих об'єктів. Але це базово, це одне з питань, яке робоча група мала би вирішити, яким основним шляхом піде. Великими площами, складними планами, чи малими площами і з простішими планами управління. Дякую.
Крайні запитання на сьогодні. На жаль, вже у нас майже вичерпався час. Прошу, представляйтесь.
Дуже дякую. Василина Нікульнікова, громадська організація Міжрегіональне бюро екологічного захисту, Криворізький регіон. На превеликий жаль, я хотіла поставити питання пану Ернандесу. Я думаю, пан Ральф допоможе мені з цим запитанням вирішитися, оскільки, в принципі, питання стосувалося лише одного. Наскільки готове представництво ЄС бути на стороні громадськості, бути союзником громадськості в тому, щоб можна було вирішити ті проблеми, які виникають у нас з урядовими органами. Якраз в цьому і питання, суть розбудови цієї мережі. Оскільки, як пан Листопад зауважив, погодження неможливо одержати. Ми не можемо представляти...
Approval is impossible to receive. We cannot represent our regions in governmental offices. So how strongly can we expect your support?
Well, I do not have a mandate to speak on behalf of EU delegation, unfortunately, at all. I mean, that is why I can only just always encourage the EUD, and that's what I'm trying all the time, because I'm really working like a facilitator in this respect only. Because I'm following your interest and the interest basically of the ministry, and always push the EU delegation, and not just the EU delegation, but I'm constantly also in touch with the Commission in Brussels myself, because I'm working for the Commission from time to time, also to support this. But I cannot tell you at all what is behind the scene, what is the delegation doing and so far. I'm just pushing, like you or others.
Дякую всім.
Thank you very much. A huge thank you to all the participants. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, so if you have any questions, you will be able to ask them privately, and I think we will be rounding it off for today. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. As I understand, we have coffee. So our colleagues will help us to find our way. So I invite us all to continue communication over there, and we will also be able to enjoy the Emerald Network Territory exhibition down